I wasn't looking for mud flood evidence when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the architectural history of 19th century municipal water systems, drainage infrastructure, the kind of subject that fills the back shelves of university libraries and rarely makes it onto anyone's reading list. I was tracing the expansion of underground sewage networks across European and American cities in the 1850s and 1860s, try to understand why so many cities invested so heavily in subterranean infrastructure during roughly the same decade. It seemed like a straightforward engineering history project. Then I started noticing something that had no place in an engineering history project. In city after city, the official documentation described the construction of new drainage systems passing through what the records called previously undisturbed subsoil. But the engineering drawings told a different story. They showed pipes being routed around existing underground obstructions, walls, foundations, chambers, that the official reports simultaneously claimed did not exist. The engineers were navigating around something, and then writing reports that said there was nothing to navigate around. I set aside the drainage project. I started pulling different documents, and within 3 months, I had assembled something that I still find difficult to fully articulate: a pattern of coordinated non-excavation stretching across dozens of cities, spanning more than a century, with a paper trail that institutional sources have done everything in their power to make difficult to follow. The question that brought me here is deceptively simple. Every major city that shows evidence of the mud flood phenomenon, the half-buried buildings, the lowered ground floors, the windows that begin at what is now street level, was subject to massive reconstruction projects in the mid to late 1800s. They were repaved. They were regraded. They were rebuilt from what authorities described as the ground up. And yet, not one of these cities, not a single one, conducted a systematic archaeological excavation of what lay beneath before that reconstruction began. They rebuilt everything, and they dug up nothing. Once you understand why, official explanations began to collapse entirely. The first time I held the St. Petersburg Municipal Survey photographs from 1862, I understood that I was looking at something that the official narrative had no satisfying answer for. These are albumin prints. Held in a private collection, I was given access to through an intermediary contact in the historical preservation community. The photographs show Nevsky Prospect during what the city's official records described as routine road resurfacing operations. The grain is consistent with wet collodion process photography, placing them firmly within the correct technical period. The shadows fall at angles consistent with late afternoon summer light in that latitude. There is nothing about the photographic evidence itself that suggests manipulation or retrospective fabrication. They predate the technology required to fake them with any sophistication. What they show is this: workers operating at a level approximately 9 to 11 feet below what was, at the time of the photographs, the established street surface. The workers are not digging down. They are working laterally, moving material horizontally away from structures that are already exposed. The buildings visible at the edges of the excavation zone show window frames beginning at what should, by any architectural logic, be basement level. But the windows are finished windows. They have decorative stone surrounds. They have iron hardware. They are not basement ventilation openings. They are the primary windows of what were clearly intended to be ground floor rooms. The official explanation from the St. Petersburg City Archive, when I submitted a formal research inquiry, was that these photographs document the installation of the city's first gas line infrastructure, and that the depth discrepancy is explained by the particular soil composition of that section of Nevsky Prospect, which allegedly required unusually deep trenching for pipe stability. I read that explanation carefully. I read it 3 times. The trench width visible in the photographs are between 40 and 60 feet across. You do not need a 40-foot wide trench to install a gas line. You do not need to expose the entire face of a building's ground floor to lay pipe beneath a street. The Smithsonian Institution's photographic archives contain a parallel set of images from Chicago dated to the period immediately following the Great Fire of 1871. The official historical record is well acquainted with Chicago's rebuilding after the fire. What the official record discusses far less comfortably is the pre-fire documentation that survived in certain insurance company archives. Specifically, the Aetna Survey Photographs Commission for Building Assessment purposes in 1869. In those photographs, taken 2 years before the fire, several structures along what is now South Michigan Avenue show ground floors that sit at a level inconsistent with the current street grade by between 6 and 12 feet. The Etna archives were partially transferred to Smithsonian in 1934. When I submitted a request for the specific survey folders, I was informed that the relevant boxes had been transferred to off-site storage and were not currently available for researcher access. That response arrived in writing. I have kept it. The grain matched in photograph after photograph. The architectural details, the specific proportions of rusticated stonework, the radius of arch profiles, the module spacing of iron facade elements, all spoke to a coherent building tradition executed at a scale that implied permanence, investment, and population. These were not frontier structures. These were not provisional buildings. They were built to last centuries. And then, somehow, their ground floors ended up underground. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across geographies that should, by every conventional historical account, have no connection to one another. In St. Petersburg, the ground floor burial averages between 8 and 12 feet across the city center, with the deepest concentrations around the Winter Palace complex and along the Fontanka River embankment. In Buenos Aires, the barrio of San Telmo, officially the city's oldest surviving neighborhood, contains buildings whose lower floors are documented in an 1867 Argentine engineering survey as having been recovered from deposit during municipal drainage works, with the deposit material described as a homogeneous silted clay inconsistent with the local alluvial geology. The depth of recovery in that survey, 9 feet. In Delhi, the area surrounding what was designated as New Delhi during the British colonial reorganization shows a consistent pattern of pre-colonial structures whose foundation lines, when traced in the British survey records of 1905 through 1911, sit between 7 and 15 feet below the contemporary surface. The British engineers who produced those surveys noted the anomaly and attributed it to centuries of accumulated debris and habitation layering. But habitation layering does not produce homogeneous deposits. It produces stratified layers with distinct cultural material at each level. The deposits beneath Delhi's colonial-era structures, as described in those same surveys, were homogeneous, uniform, laid down. The evidence suggests in a single event. In Leipzig, reconstruction records from the 1860s describe the removal of what city engineers called ancient fill material from a Marktplatz area prior to the installation of new paving. The volume of material removed, calculated from the contractor payment records which survive in the Leipzig Statarchiv, was approximately 340,000 cubic meters for a city center measuring roughly 4 city blocks. That is not accumulated debris. That is not centuries of gradual layering. That is a burial event. In Lahore, the Colonial Survey records from 1870 document structures in the walled city whose upper stories, their visible, inhabited upper stories, showed architectural detailing inconsistent with the construction methods available to the populations known to have occupied the city in the preceding 2 centuries. The surveyors noted it. They moved on. Nobody asked the obvious question about what lay beneath the street-level threshold of those same structures. The measurements, the depths, the material descriptions, the geographic distribution. The proportions align across 4 continents with consistency that randomness cannot explain. Who were they built for? The name Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s with matter-of-factness that should give anyone pause. Not as a legend, not as a mythological designation applied to vague eastern territories by ignorant Western cartographers. As a named, bounded, administered political entity covering an enormous portion of the Eurasian landmass, appearing in the works of cartographers from Blau to Vischer to the official French Royal Cartographic Office, with internal geographic subdivisions, named administrative regions, and consistent boundary delineations across independent map-making traditions from different countries who had no obvious reason to coordinate a fictional geography. Tartaria was real. This is not a fringe claim. The maps exist. They are in archives. They are photographed and cataloged, and if you know where to look, publicly accessible, what is not publicly discussed, what the academic treatment of these maps consistently and conspicuously avoids, is the question of what happened to this entity, not where it went in the sense of political dissolution or conquest or absorption. Those things leave records. Conquest leaves treaty documents and military dispatches and population registers and taxation records and 1,000 administrative artifacts of one power absorbing another. Tartaria left none of these. It does not appear in the record as conquered. It does not appear as renamed. It appears in map after map through the 1700s, and then, in the cartographic record of the early 1800s, it simply is no longer there. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. And here is where the connection to the mud flood cities becomes impossible to ignore. The geographic footprint of Tartaria, as consistently delineated across the independent cartographic traditions of the 17th and 18th centuries, overlaps with extraordinary precision with the densest concentrations of mud flood evidence. The cities of the Russian interior, the Central Asian urban centers, the Siberian settlements whose founding dates are treated by official history with a vagueness that should itself be suspicious. These are Tartarian territory by the maps. And these are precisely the locations where the buried ground floors, the homogeneous deposit layers, the non-excavation policies, and the sudden reconstruction booms of the mid-1800s concentrate most densely. The question of whether Tartaria was a civilization that built these structures that then ended up buried, is one I cannot answer with certainty. But the geographic correspondence between Tartarian territory and mud flood evidence distribution is a pattern the evidence makes impossible to dismiss. What makes the non-excavation policy so remarkable is that it was not silent, it was documented. Contemporary newspapers covered the reconstruction projects in considerable detail, and within that coverage occasionally, the evidence surfaces in ways that were clearly not intended to become part of the permanent record. The Philadelphia Inquirer, 1873, ran a brief item on page 6 describing the removal of an extraordinary quantity of compacted earth material from the foundations of several structures on Chestnut Street during municipal improvement works, noting that the material appeared to have been deposited rapidly rather than accumulated gradually, and that workers had uncovered finished stonework of unknown origin at a depth of approximately 10 feet. The item ran once. There was no follow-up. The St. Louis Dispatch, 1879, carried a report from a civil engineering correspondent describing excavation works near the old French colonial district, in which workers encountered at depth what appeared to be an intact room, its ceiling formed by the current street surface, containing furniture of European manufacture but of unfamiliar design. The correspondent noted that city engineers had ordered the space sealed and the excavation continued around it rather than through it. The report described this decision as made at the instruction of parties unnamed. No further reporting followed. The Chicago Tribune, 1885, published a letter to the editor from a contractor named in the text as W.H. Brandower, describing his experience during foundation work on the near north side, in which his crew had reached at 11 feet a surface of dressed limestone pavement of a quality and extent inconsistent with any building project previously recorded for that location. Brandower wrote that he had reported the discovery to the city engineer's office and had been instructed to proceed with his contracted work and make no further record of the matter. The letter was printed. There is no evidence it prompted any official response. The London Illustrated News, 1891, ran a feature on the ongoing Thames Embankment extension works that included, almost incidentally, a description of workers encountering at depth extensive evidence of prior habitation and construction considerably below the anticipated natural ground level, with the supervising engineer quoted as attributing the anomaly to the complex and not fully understood depositional history of the Thames floodplain. The photographs that accompanied the original article, according to the Archive Index, included images of the excavation. Those images are listed in the index, but are not present in the bound volume. Someone removed them after binding. The report stopped abruptly after approximately 1921. The photographs stop. The newspaper references to anomalous underground discoveries stop. The pattern of reporting, fragmented and incidental as it was, simply ceases. What changed? The Smithsonian Institute expanded its archaeological oversight mandate in the United States during this precise period. Similar institutional expansions of archaeological oversight authority occurred in Britain, France, Germany, and Russia within roughly the same decade. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence carefully. What if the mud flood was not a gradual process and not a geological anomaly, but a rapid, large-scale depositional event, or series of events, that buried an existing, functioning civilization across an enormous geographic footprint in a relatively short period? And what if the reconstruction project of the mid-1800s were not the organic, locally driven urban renewal efforts that official history describes, but coordinated, externally directed project to resettle and repurpose the surviving infrastructure of that buried civilization, to move populations into buildings whose lower floors were already underground and present those buildings as newly constructed? Why would this require a non-excavation policy? Because excavation would reveal the previous occupants, their artifacts, their material culture, their evidence of a level of technological and organizational sophistication inconsistent with the official narrative of gradual human progress toward modernity. The buried ground floors contain things: the St. Louis room with furniture, the Leipzig chambers implied by the volume calculations, the Philadelphia stonework. These are not empty spaces. They are inhabited spaces, suddenly entombed, left as they were. The architecture itself points to this. The grand municipal buildings of the mid to late 1800s, the city halls, the train stations, the public baths, the post offices, are built at a scale and with decorative sophistication that the population supposedly constructing them, emerging from decades of post-Napoleonic economic disruption, had neither the workforce, the capital, nor the trained artisanal tradition to produce in the quantities the historical record claims. They were not built from scratch. The evidence suggests they were inherited, cleaned, re-windowed, re-doored, assigned new foundation dates in official documents, and the question of what or who had occupied their buried lower floors was quietly, systematically, permanently set aside. They don't debate this evidence. That is the first thing you notice when you begin to bring it into academic context. They don't engage with the photographic record. They don't attempt to explain the volumetric calculations from the Leipzig contractor payments. They don't address the geographic correspondence between Tartarian cartographic territory and mudflood evidence distribution. They simply treat the entire framework as beneath engagement, as the kind of thing that serious scholars do not discuss, and that the act of discussing marks you as not a serious scholar. It's not active suppression in the sense of men in dark suits confiscating documents. Though documents do appear to go missing with regularity, I find difficult to attribute entirely to the normal entropy of archival management. It's passive erasure. It operates through professional incentive structures that make the cost of engagement too high and the reward too low. It operates through the organization of knowledge into disciplines that each own a piece of the picture and are structurally discouraged from assembling the whole. Architectural history does not talk to geological survey history. Municipal engineering records do not talk to cartographic history. Newspaper archive research does not talk to institutional archaeology. What happens when you try to assemble the whole across disciplines? I have submitted research proposals to 3 universities. I have received 2 rejections with brief explanations citing scope and methodology concerns, and 1 non-response. I have had 2 conversations with tenured historians who expressed genuine interest in the photographic evidence I presented and then, in subsequent communications, retracted that interest without explanation. I am not claiming persecution. I am describing a pattern in which the institutional response to this line of inquiry is not refutation. It is not counter-evidence. It is silence, withdrawal, and the gentle but firm pressure of professional consequence. The silence spans disciplines. It spans countries. It spans more than a century of scholarship during which the tools to address these questions have only improved, and the questions have only deepened. That silence is itself a form of evidence. What kind of anomaly receives no serious institutional attention for 100 years? The kind that someone at some organizational level has decided should receive none. There is one additional category of physical evidence I want to describe, because it has stayed with me since I first encountered it in a way that purely documentary evidence does not. In the collections of several regional museums in the American Midwest, and I have personally examined examples in institutions in Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, there exists what curators catalog as oversized Victorian-era tools and implements. Drawn knives with handles sized for hands measurably larger than standard human proportion, levels of a length, some exceeding 6 feet, that would be functionally awkward for a single person of ordinary stature to operate. Timber framing mallets whose weight, I confirmed by handling one with the curator's permission, was approximately 31 pounds. The museum label described it as an industrial-grade timber mallet for heavy construction use. 31 pounds. The standard timber framing mallet used in heavy construction today weighs between 4 and 8 pounds. No professional framing tradition produces mallets of 31 pounds because no professional framing tradition can accommodate the physical demand of swinging 31 pounds repeatedly in a controlled manner. The tool was not made for occasional ceremonial use. The handle is worn. The head is deeply marred with impact marks distributed in a pattern consistent with sustained working use across a long period. Someone used this tool regularly as their working implement. The auction catalogs from estates where similar tools have appeared. I have traced 4 such catalogs from the 1880s to the 1910s, described them variously as curiosities, conversation pieces, and items of uncertain provenance. The catalog copy does not ask why someone made tools at this scale. It does not ask who used them. It moves on to the next lot. The museum labels follow the same pattern. Acknowledge the anomaly. Provide no framework for it. Move on. But when you place the oversized tool evidence alongside the buried ground floors, alongside the volumetric calculations and the photographic record and the geographic distribution and the Tartarian cartographic correspondence, suddenly the 31-pound mallet isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I keep returning to those St. Petersburg photographs, to the workers moving laterally through material that shouldn't be there, around buildings whose ground floors shouldn't be underground, in a city that was supposedly constructed from marshland, within living memory of the photographs being taken. I keep returning to the question I started with, which was never really about drainage infrastructure at all. Why does every city rebuild from above? Why does reconstruction always proceed downward to a new surface rather than backward to understand what the previous surface was? Why do the engineering budgets for the great municipal reconstruction projects of the 1860s and 1870s consistently include line items for material removal, but never, not once, in any municipal record I have examined, include line items for archaeological assessment? Why do the newspaper reports of underground discoveries cluster in the decades before 1920 and then cease, with the same abruptness and the same geographic spread, as if a decision was made simultaneously in multiple countries about what category of information was no longer appropriate for public discussion? Why do the buildings survive but the excavations never happen? Not coincidence, not random variation across independent urban histories, not independent anomalies appearing by chance across 4 continents and a dozen languages, and a century of documented construction activity. Pattern? I don't have definitive answers. I want to be precise about that. What I have are questions that the official record cannot answer, photographs that the official record cannot explain, volumetric calculations that the official record cannot accommodate, and a silence from the institution's best position to investigate that is itself, I would argue, among the most significant pieces of evidence I have found. Somewhere beneath the streets of St. Petersburg, beneath San Telmo, beneath the old colonial districts and the great Victorian city centers and the mid-continental American downtowns that emerged, fully formed, from the Reconstruction boom of the 1860s and 1870s, there are rooms, there are floors, there are the accumulated material traces of people who lived in those spaces before whatever happened, happened. They have not been excavated. They have not been studied. They have not been named or cataloged or incorporated into the story. We tell ourselves about where we came from and what we built. The buildings still stand above them, rebuilt, repurposed, redocumented, but standing. And the ground floors that shouldn't be underground are still underground, exactly where the photographs show them, waiting.